I thanked my aunt for a bicycle because it was the only gift I ever remembered her giving me. She smiled in front of everyone and said, "I gave you a Mercedes Benz, though." In that moment, I realized my entire family believed a life I never lived, and I was about to be punished for being grateful for the truth instead of her lie. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. I grew up learning how to be quiet before I learned how to be confident. In our family, silence was a survival skill, and gratitude, real gratitude, was often mistaken for ingratitude because it didn't come with applause. I was the child who stayed out of the way, who didn't ask for much, who learned early that wanting things made adults uncomfortable. My cousins were louder, brighter, always wrapped in praise. I was the one adults described with phrases like easy, independent, or doesn't need much. At first, I thought those words were compliments. It took me years to realize they were excuses. My aunt, my mother's older sister, was the center of every room she entered. She dressed well, spoke loudly, and loved telling stories about how generous she was. People listened when she talked, leaned in when she laughed, nodded when she spoke about sacrifice. She liked being seen as the hero of the family, the one who stepped in when others failed. I learned early that challenging her version of events was pointless. Her stories were polished, rehearsed, and always ended with her looking noble. When I was 13, she gave me a bicycle. It wasn't new. The paint was chipped, the seat was worn, and the bell barely worked. But to me, it felt like freedom. It was the first thing that was mine. Truly mine, not borrowed, not handed down with a warning to be careful. I rode it until my legs ached, until dusk blurred the streets, until I learned every crack in the road near our house. I never forgot that gift, not because it was expensive, but because it was seen. Years passed. Life did what it does. I grew up, struggled quietly, worked hard, and learned how to stand on my own without leaning on anyone. Family gatherings stayed the same. My aunt told stories, others listened. I smiled politely. I didn't correct things. I didn't stir the water. Silence was still my language. The day everything changed wasn't dramatic at first. It was a simple family event, one of those gatherings filled with noise, food, and forced warmth. People were talking about gifts, about who had helped whom over the years. Someone joked about how lucky I was to have such a generous aunt. I laughed, embarrassed, and without thinking too much, I said, "I'll always be grateful for that bicycle you gave me. It meant more than you know." The room didn't go quiet right away. My aunt laughed first, a sharp, confident laugh. Then she said it. "A bicycle?" she repeated. "Oh, please, I gave you a Mercedes Benz." She said it like it was obvious, like I was joking, like the truth was something everyone already knew. People laughed again, softer this time. Someone whistled. Someone else said my name in a teasing way, as if I'd just told a bad joke. I felt my face burn, not from anger at first, but from confusion. My mind raced, searching for a memory that didn't exist. I wondered if this was some metaphor I didn't understand, some story I'd missed. I smiled because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. I said nothing. My silence, once again, filled in the gaps for everyone else. They assumed I was embarrassed, ungrateful, caught exaggerating. My aunt continued talking, describing a car I had never seen, a generosity I had never touched. She spoke with confidence, with details, with laughter. And the more she talked, the smaller I felt. That was the moment I realized something terrible. My family didn't just believe her, they preferred her version of me. In her story, I was spoiled and ungrateful. In reality, I was quiet and thankful for crumbs. But reality is fragile when it stands alone, and her lie had an audience. I didn't confront her that day. I didn't argue or defend myself. I went home and sat with the feeling I'd carried my whole life but never named. It wasn't just hurt, it was erasure. My experiences, my gratitude, my truth, all rewritten by someone who needed to be admired more than she needed to be honest. That night, I thought about the bicycle again, about how simple it was, about how I never asked for more, about how I never complained. And for the first time, I wondered if my silence had taught people that my story didn't matter. I wondered how many other moments had been rewritten while I stayed quiet, thinking dignity meant endurance. I didn't know it then, but that small comment, spoken so casually, had cracked something open. The lie was out in the open now, shiny and loud, and once a lie is spoken publicly, it demands either submission or truth. I went to bed that night knowing something had shifted, even if I didn't know how to move with it. I fell asleep replaying her words in my head, not with anger, but with clarity, because for the first time I saw the pattern clearly. Her generosity had always been performative, my silence had always been convenient, and the bicycle, simple, scratched, unforgettable, was the only gift that had ever been real. The days after that gathering passed slowly, like time itself was waiting to see what I would do. I went back to my routine, work, home, sleep, but something inside me refused to settle back into silence. Every time I thought about my aunt's laugh, the way she'd said Mercedes-Benz so easily, my chest tightened. It wasn't just a lie. It was a declaration. She had rewritten my life in front of people who mattered to me, and they had accepted it without question. I told myself it didn't matter. I reminded myself that I had survived worse things than a moment of embarrassment. But the truth was, that moment had followed me home. It sat with me at dinner. It lay beside me when I tried to sleep. I kept replaying my own smile, the one I used to cover confusion and pain, and I hated it. I hated how practiced it was. A few days later, my cousin called me. Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge beneath it. She asked why I'd acted strange at the gathering. She said my aunt had felt hurt, that she'd tried to joke and I'd made it awkward. Then she laughed and said, "I mean, come on, she did so much for you. That car alone?" Her voice trailed off, waiting for me to agree. That was the first time I tried to correct the story. I told her calmly that there was never a car. I said it gently, without accusation, as if I were clarifying a small misunderstanding. There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. Then my cousin sighed and said I must have forgotten. She reminded me how young I was, how stressful my life had been back then. She said memory could be tricky. When I insisted, her voice hardened just a little. Why would she lie about something like that, she asked. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, because the truth, that my aunt needed admiration the way others needed air, wasn't something people wanted to hear. So the conversation ended with polite tension and an unspoken conclusion. I was the unreliable one. Over the next few weeks, the story spread, reshaped in whispers and side conversations. I could feel it when I entered rooms. People looked at me differently, with a mix of pity and judgment. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others brought it up casually, as if testing whether I'd stick to my version. I learned quickly that truth, when it contradicts a popular lie, sounds like bitterness to those who benefit from the lie. My aunt, meanwhile, played her role perfectly. She didn't confront me directly. She didn't need to. Instead, she doubled down on her generosity in subtle ways. She talked loudly about sacrifices she'd made, about money she'd spent, about how some people never appreciate what they're given. She never said my name, but everyone knew who she meant. I watched as heads nodded, as sympathetic murmurs followed her words. Each time it felt like another brick added to a wall separating me from my own family. I started questioning myself in moments of weakness. I wondered if I was wrong to care, if maybe silence really was the more dignified choice. But then I'd remember the bicycle. I'd remember how real it was, how tangible, how honest. And I'd remember that no one had ever clapped for that gift. No one had praised her for it. That, I realized, was why it hadn't been enough. One evening, my mother came to see me. She sat quietly at my table, her hands folded, her eyes tired. She didn't accuse me, but she didn't defend me either. She said families are complicated, that it's sometimes easier to let things go than to fight them. She reminded me how much my aunt had helped the family over the years. Then she looked at me and asked why I was making things difficult now. That question hurt more than anything else, because it suggested that the problem wasn't the lie, but my refusal to accept it. I told her for the first time how alone I'd felt growing up, how often I'd been told I didn't need things because I was strong, and how that bicycle had mattered because it was one of the few times someone had given me something without expecting praise in return. She listened, tears welling in her eyes, but when I finished, she only nodded. She didn't promise to speak up. She didn't say she believed me. She just said she loved me. After she left, I sat in the quiet and made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I realized that if I stayed silent now, I would be agreeing to live inside my aunt's story forever. I would always be the ungrateful one, the unreliable one, the problem. And I knew deep down that silence was no longer dignity, it was surrender. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't dream of confrontation or public humiliation. What I wanted was something simpler and harder. I wanted the truth to exist outside me, solid and undeniable. I started looking through old photos, old messages, anything that anchored my memories in reality. I found pictures of that bicycle leaning against our fence, my younger self grinning awkwardly beside it. I found messages from years ago thanking her for it, messages she'd replied to with casual emojis, never once mentioning a car. Each piece felt like a small breath of air, proof that I wasn't crazy, proof that my life hadn't been a dream someone else could overwrite. I didn't share these things yet. I held them close, unsure of when or how they would matter. But for the first time since that gathering, I felt steadier. My aunt continued her performances, unaware, or maybe fully aware, that something was shifting. I watched her with new eyes, noticing how often her generosity required witnesses, how often her kindness came with an audience. I saw how easily people confused confidence with truth, and I understood then that this wasn't just about me. It was about a family that had learned to survive by believing the loudest voice in the room. I didn't know how the story would end, only that I was done shrinking to make her lies more comfortable. The bicycle had carried me farther than she ever imagined, not on roads, but toward a sense of self I could finally stand on. And somewhere ahead of me, I felt it, waiting quietly, the moment when truth wouldn't need to shout to be heard. Once I made the decision to stop shrinking, everything around me began to feel sharper, clearer, and more uncomfortable. It was like adjusting to a new pair of glasses after years of blurred vision. I noticed how often my aunt inserted herself into conversations that weren't about her, how she steered stories back toward her sacrifices, her spending, her generosity. I noticed how easily people let her do it, grateful not to be the target of her subtle judgment. And I noticed something else, too, how often my name came up when I wasn't there. I learned this through small comments, through sideways remarks that reached me secondhand. Someone would mention that my aunt was worried about me. Someone else would say she'd been so generous and hoped I'd learned gratitude. These words were always delivered with concern, never accusation, which somehow made them heavier. Concern implied truth, it implied authority, and my aunt wore both like a crown. I kept my distance for a while, not out of fear, but out of preparation. I needed to understand the full shape of the story she'd built before I could decide where to place my own truth within it. I listened more than I spoke. I observed how people reacted when money was mentioned, how quickly admiration followed any hint of wealth. The Mercedes-Benz had become a symbol, not just of generosity, but of status. By claiming it, my aunt had elevated herself and diminished me in one stroke. One afternoon, I ran into an old family friend at the market. She hugged me warmly and then tilted her head, studying my face. She said she'd heard so much about everything my aunt had done for me and hoped I was doing well now. There it was again, that careful phrasing that assumed a debt I hadn't incurred. Something in me tightened, but I didn't retreat this time. I told her simply that I was doing fine, that I'd learned to build my life without much help. She smiled politely, but her eyes flickered with doubt. The lie had traveled farther than I realized. That night, I took out the photos again. I studied them not as evidence, but as memory. I remembered the sound of the bicycle tires on pavement, the way my hands had gripped the worn handlebars, the pride I'd felt riding something that was truly mine. I remembered how my aunt hadn't come outside to watch me ride it, how she hadn't asked if I liked it, how she hadn't followed up at all. At the time, I had assumed she was busy. Now I understood. The gift had been complete the moment it left her hands. There was no applause to wait for. A family dinner was announced shortly after, one of those obligatory gatherings no one questioned. I considered not going. I told myself I didn't owe anyone my presence. But something inside me nudged forward, quiet but firm. Avoidance would only preserve the lie. If the truth was ever going to breathe, it needed air. I arrived early, as I often did. It gave me time to settle my nerves, to remind myself that I wasn't there to fight. I was there to exist honestly. As people trickled in, the familiar roles fell into place. My aunt arrived last, as usual, dressed impeccably, laughter following her like perfume. She greeted everyone loudly, then spotted me. For a brief moment, something unreadable crossed her face. Then she smiled and hugged me tightly, a performance within a performance. Dinner unfolded predictably at first. Conversations overlapped, plates were passed, laughter rose and fell. I listened. I waited. And then, as if on cue, someone mentioned cars. A casual comment, nothing more. My aunt seized it effortlessly, launching into a story about reliability, about quality, about knowing when to invest in the best. She laughed and said some people don't understand value until it's gone. Then she looked at me and smiled. "I tried," she said lightly, "but you can't force appreciation." The table went quiet, not silent but attentive. This was the moment she'd orchestrated, whether consciously or not. My heart pounded, but my voice, when I spoke, surprised me. It was steady, calm, almost gentle. I said her name and thanked her again for the bicycle. I said it changed my life in ways she probably never knew. Her smile faltered just enough to notice. She laughed again and said the line everyone expected now, the one that had grown familiar in whispers. "Oh, please," she said, "you always forget the Mercedes." This time I didn't smile. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of lying. I simply said that there had never been a car and that I had proof of the gift I did receive. I showed the photos, the messages, the dates. I passed the phone around slowly, deliberately, letting people see for themselves. The room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There were no gasps or shouting, but something fundamental changed. My aunt's laughter didn't return. She crossed her arms, her expression tight, and said memory was unreliable, that photos could be misleading, but her voice lacked her earlier confidence. The story she'd told so many times had never been challenged with facts. No one defended her outright. That was what struck me most. People murmured, exchanged looks, asked quiet questions. The Mercedes-Benz, once so shiny in their imaginations, dulled under scrutiny. And in that dulling, something else emerged, a recognition that I had been telling the same simple story all along. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't need to. I'd said what I came to say. As I left, my aunt didn't stop me. She didn't apologize either. Some people might call that a lack of closure. To me, it was clarity. In the days that followed, messages came in slowly, some awkward, some apologetic, some neutral. No one made a grand declaration of belief, but the tone had changed. The whispers softened, the assumptions loosened, the lie no longer had the same grip. I realized then that truth doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it slips quietly into a room and rearranges things while no one is looking. My aunt still tells stories, still seeks admiration, but now there's a pause when she speaks, a hesitation where certainty used to live. And I no longer feel the need to correct her every time. The bicycle still exists, in memory and in meaning. It reminds me that real generosity doesn't need embellishment, and that dignity doesn't mean silence when silence costs you your story. I learned that day that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stop agreeing to disappear. After that dinner, life didn't suddenly transform into something neat or forgiving. There were no heartfelt confessions, no dramatic apologies that wrapped everything up with a bow. Instead, what followed was quieter and in many ways harder. It was the slow adjustment of people realizing they might have been wrong and not knowing what to do with that realization. I felt it in half-finished sentences, in invitations that sounded cautious, in phone calls that started warmly and ended awkwardly. The lie hadn't exploded. It had simply begun to lose its power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one carrying all the discomfort. That weight had shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. My aunt still attended gatherings, still dressed impeccably, still spoke with authority. But something about her presence had changed. She seemed sharper around the edges, quicker to defend herself, more careful with her words. Where she once spoke freely about her generosity, she now kept things vague. It was subtle, but it mattered. I watched this shift with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because she was still my aunt, still someone I'd once hoped might see me more clearly. Relief because I no longer felt trapped inside her version of my life. I'd stepped out of it, and the air felt different here, lighter even when it was tense. One afternoon, weeks later, she called me. I stared at my phone for a long moment before answering. Her voice was controlled, polite, almost formal. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation and didn't like how things had unfolded. She said she felt misunderstood. I listened without interrupting, noticing how carefully she avoided admitting to anything concrete. Then she said something that surprised me. She asked why I hadn't come to her privately instead of making a scene. I told her the truth. I said I'd been quiet my entire life. I said I'd corrected the story privately before and it hadn't mattered. I said I hadn't intended to embarrass her, only to exist honestly. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to wonder if she'd hung up. Then she sighed and said, Families need harmony more than truth sometimes. That sentence settled heavily between us. I realized then that we were speaking different languages. To her, harmony meant control, appearances, a smooth surface. To me, harmony meant not having to deny my own experiences to keep others comfortable. I told her gently that I couldn't carry stories that weren't mine anymore. She ended the call shortly after, polite to the end. After that, I stopped waiting for her to change. I stopped hoping for validation from people who had found it easier to believe a fantasy than a quiet truth. I focused instead on my own life, the one I had built piece by piece without applause. I poured my energy into work, into friendships that didn't require performance, into moments that didn't need witnesses to be meaningful. Still, the family dynamic continued to evolve in small, unexpected ways. My mother began asking more questions, not confrontational ones, but thoughtful ones. She started remembering moments from my childhood she'd brushed aside before. Once, she apologized for not noticing how often I'd been overlooked. It wasn't dramatic, but it was sincere, and it mattered. Other relatives approached me cautiously, as if unsure whether they were allowed to acknowledge the shift. Some admitted they'd always felt something didn't quite add up. Others said nothing, but treated me with a new respect, listening more closely when I spoke. I learned that belief doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as attention. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I realized how deeply I'd internalized the idea that I didn't deserve much, how often I'd minimized my own needs to avoid being a burden. The lie about the Mercedes-Benz hadn't just been about money or gifts. It had reinforced a narrative that I'd been lucky, spoiled, indebted. Letting go of that lie meant relearning how to ask, how to expect fairness, how to take up space without apology. There were moments when doubt crept back in, times when I wondered if it would have been easier to stay silent, to let the story stand. But then I'd remember the feeling of passing my phone around that table, my hands steady, my voice calm. I'd remember the relief that followed, the quiet certainty that I'd done the right thing. That memory became a kind of anchor. I began telling my story differently, not with bitterness, but with clarity. When people asked about my upbringing, I spoke honestly, without embellishment or defense. I didn't lead with the betrayal, I led with resilience. I talked about learning independence early, about finding value in small things, about the bicycle that taught me freedom long before I understood its importance. And I noticed something surprising. People listened. My aunt's influence, once so absolute, began to feel limited. She still had her admirers, still commanded attention, but she no longer defined me. Her stories no longer shaped how I saw myself. That separation was the real victory, not the quiet embarrassment she'd endured. One evening, as I was cleaning out old boxes, I found a photo I'd forgotten about. It showed me standing beside that bicycle, younger than I remembered, one foot on the ground, one foot on the pedal, looking unsure but proud. I stared at it for a long time. That child hadn't known how small she was made to feel later. She'd only known the joy of movement, of ownership, of possibility. I realized then that the story had come full circle. What began as a simple thank you had become a reclamation. I hadn't exposed a lie to punish anyone. I'd done it to reclaim my own narrative, to give that younger version of myself the respect she deserved. The family may never fully acknowledge what happened. My aunt may never admit the truth aloud, but I no longer need that admission. I've learned that closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from standing firmly in your own memory and refusing to let it be rewritten. And in that quiet resolve, I found something I hadn't expected: Peace. Peace, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or arrive all at once. It settles slowly, like dust after a storm, and you only notice it when the air feels lighter. In the weeks after that call with my aunt, I felt that lightness more often than I expected, not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer bracing myself for impact. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head or wondering which version of me would be discussed when I wasn't in the room. For the first time, I trusted that my truth could stand without me guarding it constantly. That didn't mean there weren't moments of friction. Family patterns don't dissolve overnight. There were still gatherings where my aunt's voice carried farther than others, still comments about generosity and sacrifice that hovered just short of accusation. But now, when those moments came, I felt a distance from them, as if they were happening on the other side of a glass wall. I could see them clearly without being pulled inside. One afternoon, I met a cousin for coffee. We'd grown up close once, before adulthood and unspoken loyalties drifted us apart. She stirred her drink slowly, eyes focused on the foam, and then said she'd been thinking about that dinner. She admitted she'd always assumed I'd been given more help than I let on, and that it had shaped how she saw me. Saying it out loud seemed to surprise her. She apologized, not dramatically, but sincerely. I thanked her, and we sat in a quiet that felt honest rather than strained. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that lies don't just elevate the person telling them, they distort everyone around them. People make judgments based on stories they're handed, rarely stopping to question the source. I had been living with the consequences of a narrative that wasn't mine, and so had others, without realizing it. At home, I began sorting through old belongings, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. I wanted to decide what to keep and what to let go of. As I went through letters, photos, and small keepsakes, I noticed how few of them involved my aunt, not because she wasn't present in my life, but because her presence had always been more about being seen than about connecting. The contrast was stark. Real care left quiet traces. Performative care left stories. I found myself thinking about generosity in a new way, about how true generosity doesn't need witnesses or exaggeration. It doesn't require repayment in admiration or silence. The bicycle fit that definition perfectly, even if it hadn't been intended that way. Once it was given, it was done. No strings, no speeches, no ongoing claim. In its simplicity, it had given me more than any luxury ever could. As months passed, the family settled into a new rhythm. My aunt and I remained polite, distant, civil. We spoke when necessary, avoided deeper conversations. I no longer expected warmth from her, and that acceptance freed me from disappointment. Sometimes I caught her watching me from across a room, her expression thoughtful, guarded. I wondered what story she told herself now, whether she believed her own version or had quietly revised it. I realized I didn't need to know. What surprised me most was how my own voice changed. I spoke up more, not just in family spaces, but everywhere. At work, I asked for what I deserved instead of waiting to be noticed. In friendships, I expressed needs instead of assuming they were burdens. It was as if reclaiming one truth had unlocked others I'd been holding back. There was a moment, small but telling, that made me realize how far I'd come. A new acquaintance complimented my independence and joked that I must have grown up spoiled. The word used to sting. This time I smiled and said I'd grown up learning to make do and that it had served me well. The conversation moved on, easy and uncharged. I didn't feel the need to correct an entire backstory. I trusted myself to know who I was. Occasionally, someone would still mention the Mercedes-Benz, usually with uncertainty, as if testing whether the story still held. I responded calmly, consistently, without bitterness. I said there was never a car and that I was grateful for the bicycle. Repetition, I learned, is powerful when it's grounded in truth. Over time, the exaggerated story lost its appeal. It wasn't interesting without conflict. It wasn't impressive without belief. My mother and I grew closer in ways we hadn't before. She listened more carefully now, not just to my words, but to what lay beneath them. Once she told me she admired how I handled everything without cruelty. Her voice trembled slightly as she said it. I understood then that my standing up hadn't just changed how others saw me, it had changed how she saw herself, too. I began to think about the younger version of me less with sadness and more with gratitude. She had survived with grace, even when she didn't know she was doing it. She had accepted less without becoming small. She had found joy in a scratched bicycle and turned it into freedom. Honoring her meant continuing to live honestly, without shrinking or embellishing. The story no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a lesson, one I carried with me gently. I learned that truth doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It needs consistency, calm, and the courage to be spoken when it matters. I learned that dignity isn't silence, it's alignment. And I learned that sometimes the quietest gifts teach us the loudest truths. I don't know what my aunt tells people now. I don't need to. My life no longer exists as a prop in anyone else's performance. It exists as it always has, steady and real, shaped by small acts and honest effort. When I think back to that moment, the laugh, the claim, the room full of believing faces, I no longer feel anger. I feel clarity. Because in the end, she could claim a Mercedes-Benz all she wanted. I was the one who learned how to ride forward on my own. Time has a way of revealing what moments only begin to uncover. As another year passed, the ripples from that one sentence my aunt spoke continued to spread, quieter now, but still reshaping things beneath the surface. What surprised me wasn't how much others changed, but how much I did. I began to recognize patterns in my own behavior that I'd never questioned before. How often I anticipated being misunderstood, how quickly I softened my words to avoid sounding demanding, how reflexively I minimized my own achievements. Those habits hadn't formed in isolation. They were the residue of growing up inside someone else's narrative. Once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. And once I couldn't unsee them, I had a choice. I could keep living as though I needed permission to take up space, or I could begin unlearning what had never been true. That process was slow and uneven. Some days, confidence came easily. Other days, old doubts crept back in, whispering that standing firm would cost me connection. But even on those days, I noticed something new. The doubts no longer felt like commands, they felt like echoes. I started therapy around that time, not because I was in crisis, but because I wanted language for what I'd lived through. I wanted to understand how a single lie could shape an entire family dynamic, how gaslighting didn't always come with cruelty, but sometimes with smiles and concern. Talking it through, I realized how often I had been positioned as the easy one, so others wouldn't have to do better. Being low maintenance had protected everyone else from discomfort, but it had come at a cost to me. In those sessions, I talked about the bicycle more than I expected, about how it represented both care and neglect, generosity and indifference. My therapist pointed out something I hadn't considered, that I'd held on to that gift not just because it was meaningful, but because it was proof that I wasn't invisible, that someone, at least once, had seen a need and met it. Even if they never acknowledged its impact, I had. Family gatherings became less frequent as life pulled us in different directions. When they did happen, they felt different now, less like performances and more like coexistence. My aunt and I maintained our distance. There were no more grand stories about what she'd given me. In fact, she spoke less about me altogether. At first, that absence stung. Then I realized it was a gift in itself. I was no longer useful to her narrative. One evening, after a particularly quiet family dinner, my mother walked me to my car. She hesitated before speaking, then told me she'd been thinking about her own role in everything. She said it had been easier to let my aunt take up space than to question her, easier to believe I was fine than to admit I might need more. She apologized again, this time without qualifiers. I hugged her, feeling something loosen inside me that I hadn't known was still tight. As my internal world shifted, so did my external one. Opportunities opened up in unexpected ways. I applied for a position I'd once convinced myself was out of reach and got it. I negotiated my salary without apologizing. I noticed how people responded differently when I spoke with certainty instead of deference. It wasn't that I became louder, I became clearer. And clarity, I learned, carries its own authority. There were moments when the old story resurfaced, usually through people who hadn't been close enough to see the change. A distant relative once joked that I must be driving something fancy now, given how generous my aunt had been. I smiled and said I drove myself, and that was enough. The joke fell flat. The lie had lost its shine. I thought about my aunt often, not with resentment, but with curiosity. What did it cost her to maintain that image for so long? What fears drove her need to be admired? I didn't excuse her behavior, but I stopped personalizing it. Understanding, I realized, doesn't require forgiveness. It requires perspective. One day, while visiting a local park, I saw a child learning to ride a bike. The parent ran alongside, hand hovering near the seat, voice full of encouragement. The child wobbled, steadied, and then pedaled forward on their own, laughing. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching. The scene stirred something deep and familiar. I thought about how no one had run beside me when I learned, how I'd fallen and gotten back up alone, and how that independence, born of necessity, had become one of my greatest strengths. I didn't resent that anymore. I honored it. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I'd started doing regularly. I wrote about how stories shape us, about who gets to tell them, about the courage it takes to revise them. I wrote about how easy it is for lies to thrive when the truth is quiet, and how powerful quiet truth becomes when it finally speaks. The words flowed easily, without anger or defensiveness. They felt like closure. The moral of my story, if there is one, isn't about confronting liars or exposing hypocrisy. It's about knowing yourself well enough that no one else gets to define you. It's about understanding that gratitude doesn't mean silence, and humility doesn't mean erasure. It's about recognizing when peace is being offered at the cost of your own reality and choosing differently. I don't carry the bicycle with me anymore. It's long gone, replaced by other things, other milestones. But its lesson remains. It taught me how to move forward using my own strength, how to balance, how to keep going even when the road isn't smooth. And when I think of my aunt's claim now, it no longer feels like an insult. It feels like a marker, a moment that forced me to choose between a story that diminished me and a truth that set me free. I chose the truth, and I keep choosing it every day, quietly, steadily, without needing anyone else to applaud. Choosing the truth didn't mean the past disappeared. It meant the past stopped controlling the present. I began to notice how often memories surfaced differently now, less like open wounds and more like chapters I could revisit without losing myself in them. Certain family stories, ones I'd heard repeated for years, started sounding hollow when I replayed them in my mind. I could hear where facts had been stretched, where silence had been mistaken for agreement, and instead of feeling anger, I felt distance. Distance, I learned, is sometimes the healthiest boundary of all. There were moments when my aunt attempted to reassert her presence in my life, not directly, but through small gestures that felt oddly strategic. A text on my birthday with an overly affectionate tone, a public comment on a photo praising my success and reminding others how she'd always believed in me. Each time I acknowledged politely and moved on. I no longer felt compelled to correct or explain. I understood now that not every misrepresentation requires a response. Some fade when they're no longer fed. At another family gathering months later, I noticed something that would have once gone unnoticed. When my aunt spoke, people listened, but they didn't lean in the way they used to. Conversations resumed more quickly after her stories. The attention she commanded had softened, diluted by time and quiet doubt. Meanwhile, when I spoke, fewer people interrupted. More eyes met mine. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, but it was real. A younger cousin pulled me aside that evening. She said she admired how I handled myself, how I didn't lash out or retreat. She admitted she'd grown up believing that success came from having someone powerful behind you, someone who could claim credit loudly. Watching me, she said, had changed that belief. Her words surprised me. I hadn't realized anyone was watching at all. That conversation stayed with me long after the night ended. It reminded me that truth doesn't just correct the past, it shapes the future. Even when it's quiet, it offers an alternative path for those paying attention. I thought often about the concept of inheritance, not money or property, but stories. What do we pass down without realizing it? In my family, we'd inherited a pattern of admiration over accountability, image over intimacy. Breaking that pattern didn't require confrontation so much as consistency. Each time I lived honestly, without embellishment or apology, I interrupted the cycle just a little. My aunt and I had one final meaningful conversation, though neither of us knew it would be the last. We found ourselves alone after a gathering, the noise of others fading into the background. She looked tired, older than I remembered. She asked how I was doing, and for once her voice lacked performance. I answered simply, truthfully. She nodded and said she was glad. Then she hesitated, as if considering something, before changing the subject entirely. I realized then that she might never say the words I once longed to hear. She might never admit the lie or apologize for the damage it caused. And strangely, that realization didn't hurt. I had already released the need for her validation. Her silence was no longer something I carried. It belonged to her. In my own life, milestones continued to arrive, some expected, some not. Each one felt sweeter knowing it was mine alone. When I celebrated achievements now, I did so with people who knew the full story, or at least respected my right to tell it. I learned how to accept praise without deflecting it, how to say thank you without shrinking. These small shifts felt revolutionary. There were days when I revisited that original moment, the laugh, the claim, the room full of believing faces. I examined it from different angles, not to relive the pain, but to understand it fully. I saw now how that moment had been inevitable, the collision of her need to be admired and my quiet gratitude. It had exposed a truth that had been waiting to surface for years. I began sharing my experience selectively, not as a confession, but as a lesson. When someone talked about family pressure or being misunderstood, I listened with empathy born from lived experience. I didn't rush to advise or fix. I understood that sometimes being heard is the most healing. One evening, while walking through my neighborhood, I passed a group of children racing bicycles down the street, laughter echoing behind them. I smiled, remembering the feeling of speed and wind, the sense of escape. That bicycle had been a beginning, not just of movement, but of awareness. It had taught me how small things can carry enormous meaning, how gratitude can be radical when it's honest. If I could speak to my younger self now, I wouldn't tell her to be braver or louder. I'd tell her that her quiet strength was real and that one day it would no longer be mistaken for weakness. I'd tell her that truth doesn't always arrive on time, but it arrives when it's needed most. The lie about the Mercedes-Benz tried to rewrite my story in bold strokes, but my life was written in finer lines, in moments of resilience and self-trust. And those lines, I learned, are harder to erase. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my aunt. Maybe distance will remain. Maybe time will soften things further. Either way, I'm at peace. I've learned that I don't need to win every narrative to live well. I only need to live honestly and let that honesty speak for itself. In the end, the most powerful thing I did wasn't exposing a lie, it was choosing not to live inside it. By the time another year rolled around, the story no longer felt like something that happened to me. It felt like something that belonged to my past, properly placed, no longer spilling into every corner of my present. That distinction mattered more than I expected. When pain stays unnamed, it seeps everywhere. When it's understood, it stays where it belongs. I noticed the change most clearly in how I reacted to family news. Before, any update involving my aunt would tighten my chest before I even processed the words. Now, those reactions were slower, quieter. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Emotional distance had given me room to breathe, and in that space I found curiosity instead of dread. At a large family event that summer, I watched the dynamics play out almost like an observer. My aunt was still animated, still eager to be at the center of conversations, but the energy around her felt different. People listened, nodded, then moved on. There was less reverence, more neutrality. Her stories no longer framed the room. They were just stories now. Someone asked me about work, genuinely interested, and I found myself answering without hesitation or downplaying. I spoke about challenges and progress, about what I was building. No one interrupted, no one redirected the conversation. That simple exchange felt like a quiet milestone. I realized I'd stopped waiting for permission to be visible. Later that evening, an older relative sat beside me and said something unexpected. She told me she'd always admired my independence, that she knew things hadn't been as easy for me as people assumed. She said she hadn't known how to say anything before. Her voice carried regret, but also relief. I thanked her, not because it erased the past, but because acknowledgement, however late, still has weight. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that silence doesn't always mean disbelief. Sometimes it means fear of disruption. Families, I learned, often protect their equilibrium at the expense of truth. Breaking that pattern doesn't require confrontation so much as steadiness, and steadiness was something I finally had. As my confidence grew, so did my discernment. I became more selective about where I invested my emotional energy. I stopped chasing understanding from people who had shown me repeatedly that they preferred comfort over clarity. Instead, I nurtured relationships built on mutual respect, where stories didn't need embellishment to be valued. I also began mentoring a younger colleague at work, someone who reminded me of myself years ago, quiet, capable, hesitant to take credit. Watching her struggle with self-doubt stirred something protective in me. I encouraged her to speak up, to own her contributions, to trust her memory of events even when others spoke louder. As I guided her, I realized I was reinforcing lessons I'd learned the hard way. One afternoon, she thanked me for believing in her. The words landed deeply. I thought about how rarely I'd heard them growing up and how transformative they can be when they're sincere. It made me reflect on how cycles break, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of validation passed forward. My aunt's presence in my life continued to diminish naturally, without drama. We exchanged polite messages on holidays. We attended the same events without tension. The story of the Mercedes-Benz, once so central, faded into irrelevance. Newer family members never heard it. Older ones stopped repeating it. Lies, I learned, don't age well when they're not constantly retold. I sometimes wondered if my aunt noticed the change, if she felt the loss of influence. But those thoughts no longer consumed me. Her internal reckoning, if it existed, was hers to manage. I'd learned that not every story needs an ending I can witness. One quiet evening, I took a walk alone and reflected on how far I'd come, not in achievements, but in self-trust. I trusted my memory now. I trusted my feelings. I trusted that gratitude didn't require submission and respect didn't require silence. These truths felt foundational, like something I should have known all along, but had to learn through experience. The bicycle returned to my thoughts again, as it often did, but this time without nostalgia or pain. I saw it as a symbol of movement, of leaving places that confine you, even when you don't know exactly where you're going. It represented the beginning of a journey I didn't understand then, but was grateful for now. I realized that my aunt's claim had forced me to confront a question I had avoided my entire life. Who gets to define my worth? For years, I'd let that answer shift depending on who was speaking the loudest. Now, the answer was clear. I did. That clarity didn't make me harder, it made me kinder, more patient, more grounded. It gave me the confidence to say no and the peace to say yes when it mattered. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that truth doesn't need to be defended endlessly. It needs to be lived consistently. Over time, that consistency becomes undeniable. I no longer introduce my story through contrast or correction. I simply live it. And in doing so, I've discovered that the quietest lives often carry the deepest strength. The lie that once threatened to overshadow me now feels like a footnote, a reminder of where I refuse to stay. I moved forward, not with speed or spectacle, but with intention. And that, I've learned, makes all the difference. As more time passed, the story settled even deeper into its proper place in my life. Not erased, not forgotten, but integrated. It became one of those experiences that quietly shape how you move through the world, influencing decisions in ways you don't always notice until much later. I realized I'd stopped bracing myself before family interactions altogether. The tension that once lived in my shoulders had loosened. I wasn't rehearsing responses or scanning rooms for reactions. I simply showed up as I was. That change became especially clear during a family crisis that required cooperation. An older relative fell ill, and suddenly old roles resurfaced out of habit. My aunt stepped forward immediately, offering help loudly, directing conversations, presenting herself as the organizer. In the past, I would have retreated, assuming my contributions would be overlooked or rebranded. This time, I didn't. I helped where I could, spoke when it mattered, and didn't compete for recognition. I noticed something interesting. People acknowledged my efforts without prompting. No one needed a story to explain my presence. It spoke for itself. Watching my aunt during that time was revealing. She was still generous, still involved, but her gestures seemed less performative without an unquestioning audience. There was a faint urgency to her actions, as if she sensed that admiration was no longer guaranteed. I felt no satisfaction in that realization, only understanding. When identity is built on being needed, any shift can feel like a threat. In quieter moments, I reflected on how easily gratitude can be weaponized, how often people are expected to accept exaggerations or distortions because someone once helped them in some way. I thought about how that expectation silences those who received less than the story claims. It taught me to be careful with my own generosity, to give without attachment, without the need for acknowledgement, without future leverage. I didn't want to replicate what had hurt me. I began having conversations with friends about boundaries, about family myths, about the pressure to be the easy one. I was surprised by how many people recognized themselves in my story. They spoke about being overshadowed, about relatives who rewrote history, about the quiet resentment that comes from being expected to carry someone else's narrative. Sharing my experience didn't feel like reopening a wound anymore. It felt like offering a mirror. One friend told me something that stayed with me. She said, "You didn't just correct a lie, you changed how people are allowed to treat you." That sentence reframed everything. It wasn't about proving my aunt wrong, it was about establishing that my reality mattered enough to be respected. At another family gathering, a distant relative made a passing joke about wealth and privilege, glancing in my direction. The comment would have once unsettled me. This time, it barely registered. I realized I no longer needed everyone to understand my past in order to feel secure in my present. That was a freedom I hadn't known I was missing. Later that evening, I overheard two relatives discussing my aunt's stories in hushed tones. There was no malice in their voices, just skepticism. One said, "She does tend to exaggerate." The other nodded. That was it. No drama, no confrontation, just a quiet recalibration of perception. I kept walking, a small smile forming without my conscious permission. That moment felt like closure in its truest form, not an apology, not a confession, but a shift in collective understanding. The lie had lost its authority, and I hadn't needed to fight for that outcome. I'd simply lived consistently enough for others to notice. I also noticed how my relationship with success had changed. I no longer measured it against what others believed I'd been given. I measured it against my own growth. I celebrated milestones privately and with people who knew the full context. That made them sweeter, more grounded. Success no longer felt like something that needed justification. One evening, while reorganizing my living space, I came across a small object tucked away in a drawer, a rusted bicycle bell I'd kept without realizing it. I turned it over in my hands, pressing it gently, smiling when it still made a faint sound. It felt symbolic, not of the past itself, but of continuity. I hadn't lost myself along the way. I'd carried the essence forward. I thought about how easily life could have gone differently if I'd stayed silent that day, if I'd laughed along and let the story stand. I might have continued doubting my own experiences, shrinking myself to fit someone else's version. Instead, a single moment of calm truth had altered the trajectory of my self-respect. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't become bitter. I became grounded. That distinction mattered to me. It meant I could look back without regret, knowing I'd acted in alignment with my values. The lesson crystallized slowly but clearly. You don't owe loyalty to narratives that erase you. You don't owe gratitude for things you were never given. And you don't owe silence to protect someone else's image. As the years move on, new stories will form, new dynamics will emerge, but I carry this one with me as a reminder of my own resilience. When truth feels inconvenient or lonely, I remember that it has a way of finding its footing over time. I don't tell this story to vilify my aunt. I tell it to honor myself, to honor the quiet strength it took to stand still while the world adjusted around me, to honor the version of me who chose honesty over harmony, and in doing so, discovered a deeper peace. There may never be a moment where everyone agrees on what happened. That's okay. Consensus isn't the goal. Integrity is. And integrity, once claimed, doesn't need defending. It simply is. By the time another family reunion came around, I realized something profound had shifted. Not in anyone else necessarily, but in me. I no longer measured my presence or value by what my aunt said or what others assumed. The lie of the Mercedes-Benz had lost its power years ago, but its residue, the tension, the self-doubt, the constant weighing of my worth had lingered. Now that weight was gone, I was lighter, freer, and most importantly, aware that I didn't need permission to exist as I was. The reunion was warm, casual, and quieter than many in the past. I noticed patterns emerging almost automatically: who dominated conversations, who deferred, who remained in the shadows. But instead of feeling trapped by these roles, I observed them with detachment. It was like watching a play where I already knew the script and no longer had to perform my assigned part. My aunt, predictably, tried to claim attention, her voice carrying easily across the room. People laughed at her jokes, nodded at her stories, and I watched without resentment. The room was no longer hers to control. It belonged to the sum of all our lives, not just her performance. Later, I found myself talking quietly with a younger cousin, someone I had always felt protective of, someone who reminded me of my own younger self. She confided small frustrations, things she didn't dare share with the adults in the room. As I listened, I realized the quiet power I had gained wasn't just about reclaiming my story, it was about creating space for others to reclaim theirs. I encouraged her gently, telling her that her voice mattered, that her memory mattered, that her version of events was valid even if someone else claimed otherwise. Her eyes widened slightly as if hearing it for the first time, and I felt a profound satisfaction. After that conversation, I wandered outside for a moment to catch my breath. The summer air was warm and children's laughter floated over from the yard. I watched a small boy learning to ride a bike, wobbling and falling, then getting up and trying again. The parent ran alongside, steady and encouraging. The image struck me. So many years ago, I had been that child, unsure, unsteady, without guidance, learning resilience the hard way. And yet, somehow, I had survived. More than survived, I had grown strong. I remembered the bicycle I had once received from my aunt, the object that seemed so small but had been monumental to me at the time. That gift had taught me independence in a way no lavish promise ever could. It had been real, tangible, and unquestionable. The Mercedes-Benz, the claim, the lies surrounding it, they were irrelevant in the face of what I actually had and what I actually learned. I felt a quiet gratitude, not for the false story, but for the experience that it shaped me, even in its contradiction. When I returned inside, I noticed my aunt observing me briefly from across the room. There was a subtle tension in her posture, a careful calculation in her expression. For years, she had wielded stories like a shield and a sword, but now she had no hold over my reactions. I met her gaze calmly, without challenge or invitation. She looked away first. That was all I needed. The conversations later turned to our adult lives, careers, relationships, milestones. People listened when I spoke. They asked questions. They didn't interrupt, nor did they correct. For once, my presence felt entirely my own, independent of her narrative or anyone else's assumptions. I noticed the shift in myself. I no longer softened my tone or minimized my experiences to make others comfortable. My truth existed fully, and I was unapologetic about it. After the reunion, I sat alone for a while, reflecting on how much had changed over the years. The lie that had once held so much power now seemed distant, almost surreal. I could remember the humiliation, the doubt, the feeling of being erased, but I no longer carried it as a burden. That chapter of my life had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. I had reclaimed the narrative. I thought about the younger version of myself again, the child who had received a simple bicycle, who had felt small in a room full of grand gestures and louder voices. I wanted to tell her that she was brave, even if she didn't know it at the time. I wanted to tell her that she would survive the exaggerations, the lies, and the assumptions, that she would grow into someone who could stand still while the world tried to rewrite her story, someone who could respond calmly and firmly without losing herself in the process. In the months following that reunion, I noticed small but meaningful changes in the family dynamic. Conversations became less performative, people checked facts more carefully, spoke more thoughtfully, and questioned assumptions rather than taking them at face value. My aunt's influence, once absolute, became tempered by reality. She continued to be present, but the aura of unquestionable authority she had cultivated began to fade. It wasn't dramatic or violent, it was a quiet adjustment, almost invisible but undeniable. I also began noticing the way I moved through other relationships. At work, I stopped shrinking or deflecting praise. I expressed my needs clearly in friendships. I approached challenges without hesitation, trusting that my experience, my perspective, and my voice were valid. It was liberating in a way that felt almost shocking at first. Freedom, I realized, was not something that could be granted, it was something I had claimed for myself. There were still moments of reflection, of course, moments when I thought about the past, when the weight of others' assumptions threatened to resurface, but those moments were brief, fleeting. I no longer allowed them to dictate my emotions or decisions. Instead, I used them as reminders of the resilience I had cultivated, of the lessons I had learned, of the power inherent in quiet truth. I realized, too, that the most profound changes often happen internally before anyone else notices. The world around me shifted gradually, not because I forced it, but because I no longer acted in a way that allowed lies and distortions to dominate. My stability, my consistency, and my quiet confidence changed the way people related to me. And perhaps more importantly, it changed the way I related to myself. In the end, the lesson was simple, though it had taken years to fully internalize. The truth matters most when you live it consistently, not when you demand recognition for it. Integrity is not measured by applause or acknowledgement. It is measured by whether you allow yourself to be defined by reality rather than narrative. The bicycle, the lie about the Mercedes-Benz, my aunt's claim, they all exist in my memory as markers, not of shame or anger, but of growth, awareness, and self-respect. They remind me that a single moment can shape a life, but a lifetime of conscious choices defines it. And so I continue forward, grounded in the knowledge that my story belongs to me, that my worth is non-negotiable, and that peace is found not in forcing others to see the truth, but in embodying it fully, calmly, and consistently. By the time I reached the present, I realized something remarkable. The story that had once felt like a burden had become a quiet foundation for everything else in my life. What began with a bicycle and a lie had evolved into a lesson about resilience, self-respect, and the power of truth. I had learned that our lives are rarely shaped by grand gestures alone, but by how we respond to the small, difficult moments that test our integrity. I remember one afternoon vividly. I had gone back to my childhood neighborhood for a walk. The streets were familiar yet subtly different, lined with houses that had changed hands, trees that had grown taller, and neighbors I barely recognized. I passed the park where I had first learned to ride my bicycle, the memory of scraped knees and wobbling tires flooding back. Children were still learning there, voices echoing the same mixture of fear and joy I had once felt. I stopped and watched for a long while, the weight of the past settling quietly around me, not as pain, but as a reference point, a reminder of how far I had come. I thought about my aunt as I watched. She had been a powerful figure in my life, wielding generosity and narrative as tools of influence. She had demanded admiration, even for things she hadn't fully given. But I understood now that her actions were driven by fear as much as pride, a fear of being irrelevant, of losing control, of being forgotten. I didn't excuse her, but I stopped personalizing her behavior. Her need for validation belonged to her, not me. Returning from that walk, I felt a new sense of clarity. I didn't need to reconstruct every story, nor did I need to correct every memory. I only needed to live consistently with my own truth. And in that consistency, I discovered something liberating: freedom. Freedom from the need for approval, from the expectation to shrink, from the pressure to fit into someone else's narrative. Months passed, and life continued to unfold naturally. My aunt remained a presence in family events, but the energy surrounding her was different. People listened politely, nodded at her stories, but no longer held them as gospel. The Mercedes-Benz myth, once a tool to assert authority, had lost its luster. Conversations moved on without needing her validation or intervention, and I watched it all without resentment, only with awareness. I also noticed how my own voice had grown stronger, more confident. At work, I took on projects without hesitation. I spoke in meetings without softening my tone. I asked for what I needed, knowing my worth. In friendships, I established boundaries that protected my energy without alienating others. It was remarkable how a single realization, claiming my own story, could ripple into every corner of life. Sometimes, when I reflected on the journey, I thought about the younger version of myself, the child who had received the bicycle, whose joy was simple and pure, yet whose existence had been shadowed by exaggeration and misconception. I wanted to tell her that she had been stronger than she knew, that every stumble and every moment of quiet perseverance had mattered. I wanted to tell her that her story would not be stolen forever, that the truth would find a way to shine without fanfare, and that she would grow into someone who could navigate the world without needing permission. One quiet evening, I sat down with my journal and wrote about the lessons I had learned, the truths I had reclaimed, and the peace I had cultivated. I wrote about how generosity without expectation is meaningful, how lies, no matter how loudly told, lose power when met with calm truth, and how dignity is maintained not through confrontation, but by living fully in alignment with one's own reality. Writing it down, I felt the weight of years dissolve, leaving only clarity and acceptance. I thought about the ripple effects, too. The younger cousins, the friends, the colleagues who had seen me stand calmly in the face of misrepresentation. They had witnessed something more than just a correction of a lie. They had witnessed the quiet power of self-respect, of measured patience, of truth lived consistently. And I realized impact is rarely about the dramatic moments. It's in the subtle, ongoing choices we make every day. Months turned into years. Life brought its usual mix of triumphs and challenges, joys and losses. But the way I navigated it had changed irrevocably. I no longer let external narratives dictate my sense of worth. I no longer measured myself against others' versions of generosity, success, or recognition. I had learned that peace and empowerment come not from convincing the world to see you, but from refusing to live in someone else's shadow. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. My aunt called me, not with a dramatic confession, but with a simple, quiet tone. She asked how I was, genuinely. No claims, no implied debts, no performance. I answered honestly, calmly, and for the first time in years, our conversation felt neutral, not loaded with history, not weighed with expectation. There was no apology, no declaration, but it didn't matter. I realized that closure isn't always about receiving acknowledgement from others. Sometimes it's simply the space to exist authentically, fully, without interference. I thought about how many people live their lives defined by others' stories, how often gratitude is weaponized, and how frequently silence is mistaken for compliance. I thought about the power in quietly refusing to participate in that dynamic, in consistently standing in one's own truth. The lesson crystallized. Freedom isn't granted, it's claimed. Integrity isn't recognized, it's lived. In reflection, I understood something fundamental. The bicycle, the claim of the Mercedes-Benz, my aunt's need to be admired, they were all part of a test I didn't know I was taking. It wasn't about the objects themselves. It was about whether I would allow someone else's story to overshadow mine, whether I would shrink or whether I would stand. I chose to stand. And in doing so, I discovered that dignity, once claimed, can never truly be taken away. I have carried this understanding into every aspect of my adult life. I trust my judgment, I trust my memory, I trust my instincts. I live with gratitude for what is real, and I release attachment to what is performative. I no longer carry the need to prove myself to anyone. I am no longer defined by what I am given or what others claim to give. I am defined by the choices I make, the way I treat others, and the integrity I maintain. Looking back now, I am filled with a quiet pride. Not the pride that demands applause or recognition, but the steady, calm pride of someone who has survived, who has grown, and who has reclaimed her story. The past, with all its distortions and challenges, is no longer a burden. It is a teacher, a reference point, a testament to resilience. And as I sit here today, reflecting on the journey from a simple bicycle to the complex web of family expectations and lies, I realize the ultimate truth. We cannot control the stories others tell about us, but we can control how we live our own. We cannot force acknowledgement, but we can claim our own dignity. We cannot erase the past, but we can allow it to inform us, not define us. I smile when I think about the younger me, the one who looked at a bicycle with wonder, the one who accepted less with grace, the one who dreamed quietly while the world constructed narratives around her. I want her to know that she was always enough, that the truth eventually will catch up, that silence can be a tool, but courage is the real power. And in the end, the moral is clear. It's not about what you are given or what someone claims to give. It's about how you honor your own experience, how you protect your own story, and how you move forward with integrity, grace, and unwavering self-respect. That is a gift no one can take away from you, no lie can diminish, and no claim can overshadow. The bicycle may be gone, the lie may linger in memory, my aunt may still tell her stories, but I am here, fully, authentically, and unshakably myself. The story ends not with conflict, but with clarity, not with applause, but with peace, not with triumph over others, but with triumph within.